I broke down 20 years of fantasy football data to find out what we should expect from this year's rookie quarterbacks. Will Cam Ward be a boom or a bust? And what should we expect from day three guy Shador Sanders? We'll find out on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today we are talking rookie quarterbacks, and this year's rookie quarterback class is notably weaker than most other positions. So, how should we value them compared to other years and other positions? Well, I looked through 20 years of fantasy data, checking out the career hit rates of players drafted in the ranges of this year's rookies. I categorized them based on their career fantasy production, both in the short and long term. I'll be judging the players based on their peak success and their longevity to create an overall picture of quarterback hit rate. If you've got any questions, please hit me up in the comments below, or you can hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. It'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube, as I will be going through all four positions. Plus, you can also check out my full fantasy ratings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. I have been a top 10 fantasy ranker on Fantasy Pros the last 3 years, hoping to keep that up this year and help you guys win your fantasy leagues as well. If you do need additional help with winning your fantasy leagues, you can also check out our offer to do personalized rankings for your draft. I will personalize rankings specifically for your situation to make sure you win your draft. Today, though, we're talking rookie quarterbacks, and I'll be categorizing them in 8 different categories based on their peak performance and on their longevity from a fantasy perspective. I consider longevity to being a top 30 quarterback for a certain number of years. For example, to be categorized as a superstar, you need to have at least one top 2 year and 7 years of top 30 fantasy production. Otherwise, I'm not considering you as a superstar for fantasy purposes. A stud is someone who had a top 5 year and at least 5 years of top 30 production. The starter is top 12 and at least 4 years. Backup, top 18. The solid performer was top 30. Also had some brief boom and brief value players in there. They were guys who were either top 5 or at least top 30, but didn't have those 4 years of production, but had at least 2. And finally, anyone who was only around for 1 year or didn't get into the top 30, I'm naturally considering that a bust. Obviously, whether you would consider a day 3 player as a bust is really open to your interpretation of the word, but it's just the way I'm categorizing it so we can compare between the positions. We're going to start things off talking about top 5 picks. Obviously, there haven't been enough number 1 quarterbacks, so I've gone through and looked at every quarterback that was picked in the top 5 since 2004, and there's a lot of notable names. The superstars are guys like Kyler Murray and Cam Newton, who obviously had those number 1 fantasy years and were around for a long time. Matt Ryan was also very consistent in the long term as well. These are guys that you wanted on your fantasy team when they were in their peak because they were someone that was going to win you your league. Also, plenty of studs in there. I think it's arguable that Joe Burrow's pretty much a fantasy superstar now anyway. He was massive last year and is likely to be very good this year. But according to Fantasy Pros, which I based it on for my data, he hasn't actually had a top 2 fantasy finish according to them. Baker Mayfield slipped into the top 5, so he gets in there as well, as did Carson Wentz. But you can see that even these guys that are being categorized as studs, they're not guys that were very good for their whole careers. They might have only had 1 or 2 boom years. So you've got to keep that in mind when valuing their players. There's also plenty of good, solid fantasy starters. Guys like Trevor Lawrence, Tua, Sam Darnold have been good lately. Amazing to see that CJ Stroud's never had a top 12 fantasy finish, but he has also been a very solid option. And there's also some guys in here who have at least had 1 or 2 good years, guys like Anthony Richardson. Now, it is also worth keeping in mind that I haven't categorized guys who came out last year, talking guys like Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels. Obviously, Daniels in particular looked excellent. He'll likely end up in that superstar or stud category. But based on 1 year of data, I just can't predict it. I did try when a player's been playing for 2 or 3 years to assume that they're going to play for 4 or 5 to get them into those high categories. But you can't really do that when they've only played for a couple of years. Now, the question is, what should we expect from Cam Ward? And Cam Ward's obviously in unique company in that he is the first overall pick. And we have seen that first overall picks can have mixed success. Even if we go way back when, guys like Eli Manning had great careers, but ultimately for fantasy, never even got into the top 5. There's always guys like Jamarcus Russell, who was a total bust for fantasy, and other guys like Sam Bradford, who never had anything higher than a QB 19 finish. However, in recent years, teams have gotten a little bit better with their first pick. We've got guys like Trevor Lawrence, who was pretty solid as a top 10 option, and at least seems like he's going to hang around for the long term. Joe Burrow has obviously been excellent and had a career year last year. Kyler Murray was very good. Baker Mayfield took a while to get going, but he has been very good for fantasy. Jared Goff, another one who took a while to get going. And Jameis Winston was explosive when he had his big years. Having said that, Cam Ward is pretty weak for a first overall pick. We're talking closer to Bryce Young than we are to a lot of those other names. And obviously, Bryce Young is not someone that you'd be particularly excited to have in your fantasy team. Having said that, this position still has a way lower bust value for a top 5 pick than it does for any other group of picks. Even if you drop down to the next group, which is pick 6 to 16, all of a sudden you're talking about having a bust rate that is nearly 3 times higher. So it really does make a massive difference where you're drafted as a quarterback. If you're in those top 5 picks, all of a sudden you're far more likely to succeed. And if you go down towards the Jackson Dart region, which I've categorized as picks 17 to 40, your bust rate's nearly up to 50%. So it's not so much that you can't boom when you're later in the first round or early in the second round, but guys like Cam Ward are far more likely to succeed. The team has paid a lot to get him in draft capital, and they are going to give him opportunities. And when quarterbacks get a longer runway to succeed, they're always going to have more chance of being successful. Ward also brings assets like a bit of run game, which is really good for fantasy. Plus, he does have a big enough arm that you can imagine him having a higher ceiling. So the ceiling's definitely here for him to be a fantasy stud or superstar, but I don't think it's going to happen in the near term. The Titans don't look very good, and they haven't put the pieces around him to really make it likely for him to be a success. Let's move on to the next group, and we're talking picks 17 to 40. And a lot of very good players have come in this range, guys that have dropped in drafts and ended up being real values. Guys like Lamar Jackson and Aaron Rodgers, obviously going late in the first round and having fantastic careers. Lamar, obviously excellent for fantasy based on his legs, and Aaron Rodgers has obviously been around since the dawn of time and doing good things for fantasy for a lot of that as well. There have been another couple of guys who've had 1 or 2 big years and just kind of hung around. Guys like Jordan Love seems like he's at least going to have a solid career, if nothing special. And Andy Dalton, they both had top 5 years, which is kind of crazy. And that's why it's so hard to categorize these guys. But if you've got one of these guys, having that top 5 year does mean that you'll immediately get payoff. Also, plenty of fantasy starters, guys like Derek Carr and Geno Smith, who were just pretty solid for long term, even though it did take Geno a long time to get going. You will notice, though, that there's not a lot of big names in this range. Outside those top couple of guys, not many of these guys are people that you want on your fantasy teams. The most recent guys we've had going in this range are guys like Will Levis, who just busted immediately and did nothing for fantasy. Kenny Pickett, who was a massive disappointment, presuming he doesn't get things going in Cleveland. And guys that we barely even talk about now, Paxton Lynch, Johnny Football, Brandon Whedon, who was obviously a special category in himself, Tim Tebow, guys that were going to teams that kind of reached a little bit for them in the end. And I feel like that could arguably be the case here with Jackson Dart and also with Tyler Shock. I just don't see this situation as being beneficial for either of them. Jackson Dart goes into a really ugly quarterback room. Russell Wilson is, I guess, nominally the starter, but Dart could win the winning job. Jameis Winston's still hanging around. He's a good guy to have around, but we know that Russell Wilson isn't the kind of guy who's going to take you under his wing and help you through. So this is a pretty competitive situation for him. There's not exactly fantastic receivers outside of Malik Neighbors. You don't really have much. They haven't invested in a strong number 2 option there. They keep giving money to Darius Slayton for no particularly good reason. So it is really hard to see Jackson Dart paying off in the short term. We have seen with most of these guys, outside guys like Lamar, most of these guys did take a couple of years before they really took off. And you're going to have to expect that to be the case for Jackson Dart because he is going into that situation. Tyler Shock, on the other hand, kind of gets a benefit of Derek Carr retiring. Funnily, another guy who was drafted in this range. Obviously, with Carr gone, all of a sudden he is the favorite to be the number one guy. I know Spencer Rattler is still around, but I do think we can expect it's probably going to be the rookie who becomes the starter. In his case, that means he's more likely to go in and get those opportunities. But we've seen with a lot of these players, that doesn't necessarily mean success. It's not like he has great pass catches around him. And I think his bust rate is very high. Compare his situation as more of a pocket quarterback than guys with good legs who can at least run, which has been the benefit of guys like Lamar and Colin Kaepernick, for example. All of a sudden, you compare him a lot more to a Will Levis, to a Kenny Pickett, someone who was arguably taken a little bit early. Now, the big benefit for Shock is he has played for a good, 7 years in college. He has like 4 degrees. It's absolutely crazy. So there is that benefit of him coming in ready to go. He's not young. He's not going to have to develop in the same way. But there are some big concerns about his longevity as a fantasy asset. And for that reason, I'm not too excited about getting him on my dynasty team. And I don't particularly want to touch him in redraft either. Now, we can go a little bit further down and we see some names that people are very excited about. We see one name that people are very excited about and one name that rightly nobody's excited about. And even the Browns shouldn't be. I have no idea what they were doing drafting Dillon Gabriel. He should have been an undrafted free agent. That was crazy. Regardless, not many great names picked in round 3 as quarterback. We're talking Russell Wilson, who has obviously been excellent, and nobody. Matt Schaub obviously had a couple of good years. I think it's really pushing it to consider Nick Foles as a good fantasy starter, but he did have 1 or 2 solid years, so he does slot in there. And then just a heap of guys that kind of popped up briefly and disappears, guys like Davis Mills and Jacoby Brissett. And then a whole heap of guys that we don't even talk about now. Obviously, Desmond Ridder was a big bust, but we're talking about a heap of guys that didn't even get an opportunity. Hendon Hooker hasn't really seen the field. Malik Willis was very poor. Matt Corral. Kellen Mond, these guys got like 1 or 2 games in their career and then they were out. These are the most recent players to be picked in this position. There's just a whole lot more of them. There's a heap of players that fit into that category. There's a good 20 or so that busted in exactly the same way, barely getting a chance. That's going to be Dillon Gabriel for sure. But I think it could also be Jalen Milroe because there hasn't exactly been a large success rate for players in this situation. He really needs an injury at the right time to Sam Darnold, and he's also got to hope that no one else steps in and takes that opportunity ahead of him. I think it's going to be very difficult for Milroe, who realistically is more of a running back who occasionally passes the ball. Now, we've seen that work pretty well for guys like Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson, but they ultimately were at least able to come in and develop as passers. Is Milroe going to be able to do that? Is he even going to get the opportunity? I don't know, but you're going to have to be very patient for fantasy. The good news is there's a heap of upside. We have seen that running quarterbacks can be very successful in fantasy, but for the most part, they do tend to bust in this range. So I wouldn't be feeling particularly good about Milroe, and a lot of people are going out of their way to try to get him because the upside is so high, but you've got to understand where the value lies compared to players who are known fantasy assets. Don't go out of your way to get Milroe. He really doesn't offer as much value and as much certainty as you might think. Finally, we've got all the day 3 guys. Obviously, Shedeur Sanders is the big name here, and a whole heap of backups taken in the 6th and 7th round. And you can see that most of the guys who did anything in this range were picked in that 4th round. We're talking about guys like Dak Prescott and Kirk Cousins. You like that? You like that? Cousins was obviously got some injury luck to get his start, but he was a very good quarterback for a long time. Dak obviously came in and looks good right from the start. But that's not the situation with any of these guys. I think Brock Purdy's really the only exception here of a guy who was a legit late day 3 pick who came in and did something. And again, he only got that opportunity because Trey Lance got injured. So I don't think that's necessarily the situation with Shedeur Sanders, but I also don't think he comes in and he's immediately likely to be the number 1 guy in Cleveland as much as everyone is saying. It's kind of hard to understand who to compare him to on this list. I think guys like Gardner Minshew kind of came in and did have a chance early on to make something happen. We saw Trevor Siemian certainly got a proper opportunity, and that meant those guys at least were able to give some brief value. But for the most part, guys in this range just never get a chance. And when they do get a chance, they tend to bust. We saw that with guys like Mike White, with Bailey Zappi. When they came in and actually started, they looked very mediocre, and that's very standard for a day three quarterback. I know you can argue that Shedeur Sanders is not a standard day three quarterback, and I'm inclined to agree. I do think that he fell to day three because there was so many issues that teams just didn't want to deal with. Once they decided he wasn't going to be a day one pick, all of a sudden there's no point taking him in the second or third round because the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. You're not going to get as much benefit out of him as you are going to have disadvantage of everyone wanting to talk about his situation, his dad getting involved, all the controversy around him falling. It made sense for the Browns to take him eventually because the value was too good, but I do think that he doesn't truly fit into this category, but I'm not really sure what we can expect on him based on the situation. If he becomes the day one starter, then all of a sudden his success rate will increase. But ultimately, guys taken on day three do have an over 90% bust rate. I do think we have to acknowledge that's likely the situation with Sanders. It's certainly the situation with all these other guys. As much as I like guys like Kyle McCord, the reality is that they're probably going to need 2 injuries ahead of them to become fantasy relevant. The same is the case with Will Howard, who I don't really rate as a quarterback anyway, but he was already behind Mason Rudolph. And now that Aaron Rodgers has officially signed, all of a sudden we're talking about a situation where he just becomes the number 3 like everybody else. And number 3 quarterbacks do eventually get opportunities sometimes, and they nearly always look mediocre when they get that chance. Just look at the guys on this list, look at all players taken on day 3, and the success rate is very, very, very low. So do not get excited about any of these guys in Dynasty. You're better off with somebody that you actually know is going to be a fantasy asset, even if it's in another position, or a number 2 or number 3 running back who's got more chance of turning into a starting role than a quarterback does, where your quarterback is kind of embedded for the most part. Now, before we wrap things up, we do have to talk about my rookie QB rankings and where you should be taking these guys both in rookie drafts and in redraft as well. For me, Cam Ward's the only guy who's truly of interest. In a Superflex league, I would consider taking him around 5 or 6. It really depends on how much you need the top wide receivers and running backs. I think you're going to see both the top receivers in Hunter and McMillan go off the board, and obviously Genty, plus most of the top running backs as well, guys like Henderson and Judkins and, of course, Hampton. So 7's probably the main spot for him. You might see Warren go first as well. It really depends on what you need. But from that point onwards, it is certainly Cameron Ward's season. In Superflex, in a 1 QB league, however, I wouldn't be touching him until at least the second or third round. It really depends how desperately you need a quarterback. But basically, we're talking about a guy who in a 1 QB league probably won't start for at least this year and maybe into the future unless it's a very deep league. So you're talking about someone you're going to have to put on your bench. You're going to have to wait on him. And even then, there's no guarantee he's going to offer you any value. So in a 1 QB league, certainly a late second round, early third round option in rookie drafts. In redraft, none of these guys are guys you're touching at all. Cam Ward in a Superflex league, you will think about probably around 25th or so off the ball, because you at least know that he's going to be locked in as the starting quarterback for much of the season at least. So he's got a little bit of upside there. Where that is in your league really depends on the situation. And if you do have a Superflex redraft league, I do suggest hitting me up for some personalized rankings, because the settings in your league make a massive difference for Superflex, and you can get a massive amount of value if you pick the right positions at the right times in a Superflex league. Now, behind Ward, obviously, Shock and Dart are kind of the other way around than where they were last time I did these rankings. I've dropped Dart down a little bit because of the Derek Carr retirement, and also because it does to me look like Russell Wilson is probably going to be the week 1 starter. That does make a difference when you're picking up rookie QBs. It is a whole lot harder to win the job later on than win it immediately. I do think Dart near definitely gets a chance, but realistically, if you're drafting a rookie QB, you probably want a guy who's going to start sooner rather than later. And I think it's the Saints who are going to give their rookie the chance first. Well, in a rookie draft, I would be thinking about taking him around mid to late second round. Probably no earlier than that, because realistically, you're still only going to get a season or 2 out of him. Really depends how much you need him in Superflex. In a 1 QB league, 4th round at best, only if you're desperate for a quarterback. And I wouldn't be taking Jackson Dart at all, possibly, depending on the league and depending on how deep you go. If it's a 12-team league with relatively deep benches, I'm thinking about him 4th round, potentially, as someone who might turn into a starter. But I don't know. There's a long way to go before that occurs. Even in a super flex league, Jalen Milrow, hard to take him before the third round, but at least he has some upside. And in a non-super flex league, I'm not thinking about him in Dynasty. It'd have to be a very deep league before I'm thinking about getting Milrow or anyone below that. Shedeur Sanders, for me, is pretty close to Milrow. Sanders is slightly safer. So for that reason, in a super flex league, you do have more chance of him starting in the near future. He's not going to offer you as much when he does, but at least he is more likely to offer something for fantasy at some point in the future. I think it's significantly more likely that Milrow entirely busts. I think Sanders might actually get a chance to come in and provide some brief value. But how long is that going to be? And is that going to be anything of fantasy value for you? So it's got to be a super flex league if he's going to offer any value with the Browns. And you've got to be pretty desperate for a quarterback. Everyone below that, I'm not really touching. I still think that Will Howard has a little bit of potential to take on Mason Rudolph. Kyle McCord, I think, is only going to have value if we see a Jalen Hurts injury, whereas at least with Howard, you can see a situation where potentially Aaron Rodgers comes in for a year and they like what they see from Howard as their third QB, and he makes his way up to be a future starter. That's possible. So the only way you'd be thinking about that is in a deeper league or in a league with taxi squads for super flex, where you'd go and put Howard on your bench. Dylan Gabriel, for me, really isn't someone I'm particularly interested in, but there is an outside chance as a day two quarterback that he does get that starting job. I do think it's very unlikely, though. Everyone below McCord really doesn't interest me. Guys like Riley Leonard and Quinn Ewers, you'd need to be in the deepest of dynasty leagues, ideally Superflex or like a 32-team league, before these guys start interesting you. And that's all we've got for this episode on the Fantasy First Down. I hope you've enjoyed things. I hope it's helped you out. If you've got any questions, hit me up in the comments or on Instagram or Twitter as well. It'd also be great if you could like and subscribe. I'll be back in the coming days with my running back reflections on what we should expect from Ashton Genty and a very, very, very strong running back class. Are we going to get some fantasy studs, or are we overvaluing them? A lot of people doing some trades in Dynasty around running backs, so that's one you're not going to miss. I look forward to talking to you then.